I would like to begin by expressing both my gratitude and my humility in response to the invitation to preach today. Joan and I have felt unconditionally welcomed and accepted by this community, an experience of welcome which has renewed our faith. There's a lot going on today, as Stan said. It's the Feast of the Body and Blood of Christ. It's Juneteenth, it's Father's Day, and we're in the middle of Pride Month. You know, when Eileen asked me to preach, I thought, well, maybe I should thank her with a tinge of irony in my voice because there's a lot going on today. No pressure, right? Let's see if our reflections on today's texts, yours as well as mine, can discover some common threads linking the three different feasts that we celebrate today, as well as Pride Month. Okay, I'm going to begin with a geek alert. All right. I've always loved today's reading from 1 Corinthians 11. I geek out over the antiquity of the passage. This is ground zero. This is the oldest New Testament text that we have that describes the cornerstone of our worship. These verses paint a picture of the far horizon of our faith. Whenever I go to the ocean, I'll stand on the shore and imagine the sea not as water, but as time, and know that this first Eucharist lies just beyond the curve of the earth and the curve of time. But it's out there. We share its legacy. We celebrate it today by the graces of memory, tradition, and courage. The courage is incarnated by our three priests. The tradition is alive in this community that has supported them. The memory preserved in Paul's epistle is honored by the ongoing pilgrimage of the congregation of St. Mary Magdalene. So this, I suppose, has been a first paragraph about church. In the excerpt we heard from his chapter on church, Father Greg Boyle captures the authenticity of courage, tradition, and memory as well. Over 30 years, and despite great personal danger and initial heavy criticism by both the police and a past Archbishop of Los Angeles, he has created something out of nothing. Homeboy Industries is now recognized as a ministry that liberates those residents of Los Angeles who have been enslaved by street gang culture. Homeboy now enjoys widespread support from his order, the Jesuits, from the Chancery Office, City Hall, the police, and even Hollywood. You might bump into Marty Sheen or Jane Fonda if you visit. They have all learned something about the politics of compassion because Homeboys Industries have subverted a narrow understanding of humanity. Boyle and his team don't see the gang member. They see everyone as unconditionally loved by God. They do not romanticize the destructive power of the street gang. Father Boyle has performed more than 350 funerals following violent deaths, more than one a month ever since he started the ministry. Yet the ministries of Homeboy flourish because they focus on the whole person and not the gang member. Boyle reminds us that the politics of compassion is rooted in the Eucharist. The politics of compassion is rooted in the Eucharist. There can be no walls around the common table. As he says, Jesus lived, breathed, and embodied a boundary-subverting inclusion. His observation that all Jesus really did in his ministry was attend lesbian weddings recaptures the power of Jesus' teachings. For example, when we hear the parable of the Good Samaritan, we enjoy a story about a nice guy who went out of his way to help someone in distress. However, if we were to update the narrative, we might get a clearer sense of what a powder keg this parable was in its own time. Try telling this story today in Jerusalem with the two principal characters as a leader of Hamas and a radical Zionist settler. Or go to Belfast and tell it where the two main characters are an IRA operative and a member of a Protestant militia. Imagine the reactions you would get, which is how the original audience heard about a Samaritan helping a Jewish traveler. But I have a third example closer to home. Consider a parable that my university students have always found downright revolting. In Matthew 20, the laborers who worked in the vineyard for 1 hour before sunset received the same day's pay as the guys who arrived at sunset. The students' reactions range from, "That's not fair," to, "This is outrageous." But I always catch them up short, which is not to say that I satisfy them. When I recall the final line of the story, which is spoken by the vineyard owner to the laborers who worked all day. "Is your eye evil? Because I am good." Even a short stroll in New Testament scholarship will confirm how challenging, scandalous, and liberating Jesus' teachings sounded to their first audiences. So yes, Boyle has it right. We can't follow Jesus well unless we are willing to trample all the fences around the altar, as this congregation has done. Tattoo removal is an important service provided by Homeboy Industries that also breaks down barriers. There are many ways to consider tattoo art. I confess I am not well versed in this area. For better or for worse, I'm going to die with totally clean skin. No offense to people who have tattoos. But gang tattoos represent a separate ominous variation of this practice. Gang tattoos constitute an expression of cultural piety, a piety that elevates loyalty to the gang above all else. Boyle mentions that many gang members have tattoos that literally obscure their faces. These tattoos eclipse the essence of the self. These expressions of gang piety promote violence and division. The tattoos not only generate external conflict, but internal conflict as well. They divide the self against the self. Thus, many clients at Homeboy have their tattoos removed, even though this painful procedure requires multiple appointments. They feel this is necessary to reclaim the integrity of their selfhood. In the same vein, religious piety can divide the self against the self. Eucharistic piety can become downright dangerous. Whenever the Eucharist is weaponized, it represents a politics of division. The denial of communion as a punitive measure does violence to the essence of the sacrament, as well as to those who are not allowed to receive the bread and wine. Barring someone from the table based upon their marital status, their sexual orientation, or their public views about women's reproductive rights divorces the common meal from its own inherently inclusive nature. Thus it is today in Luke's gospel that no one asked the 5,000 families about their political or religious beliefs. The text simply says that Jesus welcomed them. Jesus welcomed them. Then he taught them about the kingdom of God, first in words, next in the power of healing, and then by sharing a common meal. The connection is inescapable. The kingdom heals when its power is exerted to welcome, include, and feed. No questions asked. Also, note how Jesus empowered his disciples as he addressed them with an imperative. Give them something to eat yourselves. And we can imagine a bit of exasperation in his imperative. Jesus gave the disciples an absolute command similar to what we find in the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not murder, an absolute command. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt keep holy the Sabbath day. Thou shalt honor thy parents. All absolute commands. Give them something to eat. No caveats or exceptions apply. Once Jesus gave them the agency to feed the crowd, the disciples discovered the means to do so. To this day, Jesus has empowered his disciples so that we would never have to turn anyone away from the table ever again. This gives us the means to feed anyone and everyone because he has given us, he has freed us from a narrow understanding of humanity. With the 12 baskets left over, today's gospel narrative also suggests that our common meal is meant to be one of extravagant generosity. We dare not squander these graces on some myopic, toxic view of Eucharistic piety. To paraphrase Boyle, the politics of compassion must overwrite the politics of holiness and purity. The politics of compassion must overwrite the politics of purity and holiness. This is the faith of the far horizon, where the politics of compassion leads the way. There is another legacy of ocean and horizon marked today, that of Juneteenth. While we have the privilege of looking out on the ocean to imagine a connection to an ancient ministry, that same vista could remind our Black sisters and brothers of something sinister, the Middle Passage of the slave trade. However, that first Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865, promised a new horizon of freedom for the previously enslaved. On that date, the US Army freed the last of Texas enslaved people in Galveston. Legally and practically, manumission became the law of the land. However, this moment did not mark an end to the legacy of slavery. Even today, we must all insist that Black lives matter. But every year, Juneteenth offers an invitation to imagine a new alternative social vision, one that we must help bring into existence every day, like daily communion. This morning, 157 years after that first Juneteenth, the journey to the promised land of full freedom and equity, imagined by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., remains in progress. But here is the devastating, humbling truth of Juneteenth. It has been the Black community that has been welcoming and trying to liberate the rest of us since 1865. Just as in the same way, it is the GLBTQ community that is still welcoming and trying to liberate the rest of us. As Fannie Lou Hamer famously said, no one is free until everybody's free. Just as Jesus has done, the civil rights movement and the gay rights movement have also given us the power to be freed from a narrow understanding of humanity. Yet the continuing conflict over race and sexual orientation in this country has revealed how our humanity has been stunted by deeply ingrained pieties, whether it's deeply ingrained pieties about our whiteness or about sexual orientation. These divide us against ourselves, as well as people who are different from us, who we consider ourselves to be the mainstream in every respect. America will never, sadly, become a post-racial society. The advancement of civil rights, of human rights, of gay rights, will ever constitute a pilgrimage that, like our faith traditions, will always be contested and will always be sighing and groaning for redemption. However, as St. Paul said in Romans 8, these sighs and groans are expression of hope, not despair. If we have this hope, it's because of the love and the nurture of the families and communities that have brought us this far by faith. Today, we especially honor our fathers, which we've been doing in this country on the third Sunday of June since 1910. Many of us do so with joy, but we must also pause to recognize that for some of us, today may trigger more painful memories than warm ones. I'm blessed with warm memories. Yesterday, June 18th, was the 109th anniversary of my dad's birth. So of course, growing up, I thought Father's Day meant that a holiday had been created for my father, especially since his birthday often fell on the third Sunday in June. Those Father's Days during the Junes of my youth in Chicago wrapped me and my sister in love. They filled us with hope, a hope we still carry with us through the 8th decade of our lives. It was 8 days into this century that my dad quietly slipped beyond the horizon. But we continued to be supported and to be loved by him. Norman MacLean said it well. Nearly all those I loved when I was young are dead, but I still reach out to them. So I would conclude this morning by noting that the early Christians sometimes called Sunday the 8th day. Their communion with the divine and with each other stood out as a day beyond the reach of normal time. Today, June 19th, 2022, Pride Month, Corpus Christi, Juneteenth, Father's Day. Today feels like an 8th day. It feels like a day to stand on the shore and reach out towards the far horizon of our faith and to embrace all the love that comes to us from there. Amen.